The wind screamed like a wounded animal, tearing through the skeletal trees and rattling the rough-hewn planks of Micah Holt's cabin. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting restless shadows on the walls as he carved absent-mindedly at a block of wood, his knife slipping suddenly from his fingers. The blade clattered onto the dirt floor, but he barely noticed. A sound had sliced through the night, a raw, desperate cry, unmistakably human. It clawed at the edges of his mind, sharp and fractured, as though someone's soul were being torn from their body. Wolves answered in the distance, their howls rising like jagged shards of ice, piercing the frost-bitten sky. Micah froze, his breath catching in his throat. He'd heard every sound the wilderness could offer: a bear's growl, the snap of a deer's leg in snow, even the eerie silence that followed a storm. But this was different. This was pain. This was someone fighting to stay alive. He grabbed his rifle, its weight familiar in his calloused hands, and stepped into the blizzard. The cold hit him like a physical blow, biting through his coat as he trudged forward, his boots sinking into the snowdrifts. The cries grew louder, mingling with the wolves' guttural snarls, guiding him toward a dry creek bed where the land dipped into shadow. Through the swirling white, he saw them, shadows circling something half buried in the snow, their mangy forms hunched and hungry. The pack's yellow eyes glinted in the moonlight, their teeth flashing as they lunged. Without thinking, Micah raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The crack shattered the night, sending birds shrieking from the trees. The wolves hesitated, their ears flattening, before scattering into the darkness like smoke. At the edge of death, he found her. Her black hair, tangled and matted with blood, fanned across her face like a shattered halo. Her body was crumpled against the frozen earth, her breath hitching in shallow, uneven gasps. Blood stained the white ground in dark, spreading blooms, seeping from a gash at her side. She was Navajo. The word flared in his mind like a curse, a lifetime of hatred and fear coiled tight in his chest. Navajo, enemy, other. But then her hand twitched, a feeble motion, and her lips parted in a sound so fragile it felt like the world itself might shatter, like a bird too cold to sing. Micah's gut twisted. He dropped to his knees, ignoring the snow soaking through his trousers, and lifted her. She weighed nothing, a hollow weightlessness that made his stomach churn. Back in the cabin, he laid her by the fire, his hands shaking as he peeled away her soaked, tattered dress. Blood slicked his fingers as he pressed cloth to the wound, his mind racing through the remedies he'd learned from the old trapper who'd once saved his own life. Her skin was icy, her pulse thready beneath his fingertips. He boiled water, crushed herbs into a paste, and stitched the gash with clumsy precision, his jaw clenched against the silence. Hours passed. The fire spat and hissed, sending sparks into the air like tiny stars losing their grip on heaven. At dawn, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and endless, like the void between stars, and locked onto his. For a long moment, they stared at each other, two souls balanced on the edge of survival, both too proud to beg for mercy. She tried to sit up, but her body betrayed her, trembling violently. Micah's hand shot out instinctively, steadying her, but she stiffened at his touch. He pulled away as if burned, retreating to the corner where he slumped against the wall, rifle resting heavily across his knees. His mind warred with itself. If the town learned he'd taken in a Navajo woman, they'd come with ropes and torches, their righteousness hotter than hellfire. They wouldn't ask her name or why the wolves had hunted her. They'd only see skin and history and draw blood to match. He could end this now. One shot. Quick. Quiet. No one would ever know. He watched her from the corner of his eye as she pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders, staring into the fire with a face like stone. Not begging, not pleading, simply waiting. Micah gritted his teeth, the memory of his father's voice rising like bile. You show mercy to the wrong sort, and you'll pay for it with your blood." But then came another voice, fainter, softer, his brother Samuel, laughing before the fever took him, whispering, "A heart-to-heart, Micah. Don't matter what skin God wrapped it in." Micah rose slowly, the rifle dangling loose in his hand. The woman turned her head just slightly, a strand of her hair catching the firelight, glowing like a coal. He saw her then, not some savage ghost, but a person beaten, bloodied, yet alive, clinging to life with a fierceness that shamed him. The rifle slipped from his grasp, landing against the floorboards with a soft thud. He exhaled, a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. It shook loose something inside him, something old and cracked and aching to heal. Without a word, he crossed to the table, ladled broth into a battered tin cup, and set it near her. She watched him, those fathomless eyes never leaving his face, then slowly reached for the cup. Her hands trembled as she lifted it, but she drank. Micah sank back onto his stool by the fire, rubbing a hand over his face, feeling the stubble scrape against his palm. Outside, the storm began to ease, the world softening into a hush. Inside, something quieter and far more dangerous began to grow. Trust, thin and fragile as spring's first blade of grass. It would not be enough to save them from the world beyond the hills, but it was enough for now to save them from each other. And sometimes that was all a beginning needed. Days folded into one another like pages worn thin by weather and time. The storm had passed, but its breath still lingered, painting the mornings with brittle chill and lacing the nights with mist that clung to the cabin's window panes like half-forgotten dreams. Inside, a fragile rhythm began to take root, tentative and cautious as the first green shoot pushing through frost-hardened ground. Najcha moved about the space with quiet purpose, her strength returning in small, stubborn increments. She patched the torn seams of Micah's coat with thread finer than any he owned, her fingers swift and sure despite the lingering stiffness in her wounded side. She ground herbs into powder and mixed them with snow melt, creating salves that soothed the burns and blisters Micah had long since learned to ignore. He watched her from the corner of his eye, unsure if gratitude or guilt weighed heavier on his heart. It shamed him somehow to see her tend to the wounds he hadn't noticed piling upon himself. He tried, in his clumsy way, to repay the balance. He carved a new pair of moccasins from deer hide for her, each stitch a silent apology for the hate he'd been taught, the lessons drilled into him by his father's fists and the town's whispered venom. When she wore them, her steps grew lighter, less pained. She did not thank him aloud, but her glance, soft and brief, was worth more than 1,000 words. They spoke little. Words felt too large, too dangerous. Instead, they traded gestures. A bowl of stew placed closer to her seat by the fire, a folded blanket left where he knew she would find it. Trust was a language of its own, stitched slowly between them. Outside, the world remained hard and suspicious. Micah rode to town once a week for supplies. Each visit bristling with tension he carried back like mud clinging to his boots. The settlers' eyes grew sharper, their greetings colder. Rumors, like seeds on the wind, needed no tending to take root. He told her little of what was said beyond the ridge, but she knew. She read it in the lines carving deeper into his face, in the way his hand lingered near the rifle hanging by the door. Still she stayed. Still, he built the fire higher each night to drive back the darkness. One evening, as dusk smeared the horizon in bruised violets and soft grays, Najcha sat by the window, weaving strips of leather into a shape Micah could not name. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her mouth set in a line of quiet determination. He found himself watching her more often now, not with suspicion, but with a strange, aching fascination. There was a steadiness to her, a rootedness, as if she carried the memory of older mountains and deeper rivers in her blood. She looked up and caught him staring. Instead of looking away, She held his gaze, her eyes calm and unafraid. Something shifted between them, subtle as the turning of a leaf in the breeze. Later, when she handed him the finished piece, a woven charm meant to ward off evil spirits, he recognized the offering for what it was, a bridge, a beginning. He accepted it with both hands, bowing his head in awkward, silent thanks. In the following days, the distance between them lessened. He showed her how to chop wood without splintering the grain, how to set snares for rabbits near the creek's edge. She showed him how to brew tea from pine needles to stave off the sickness that traveled with the cold, how to mend a cracked kettle using river clay. Side by side, they became something more than strangers. Something more dangerous, too, in the eyes of a world that measured belonging by skin and blood. But the world beyond their little cabin would not forget them. It would not forgive them. One night, as the fire dwindled into coals, a sound cracked the quiet open, hoofbeats pounding across frozen earth. Micah was on his feet before thought caught up, rifle in hand, heart slamming against his ribs. Najcha moved silently to his side, her presence steadying him more than any weapon could. Through the warped glass of the window, they saw a lone rider approaching, the horse's breath fuming in the cold like a dragon exhaling. Micah recognized him before the rider dismounted. Tom Granger, a man whose mouth twisted words into poison with the same ease he twisted rope into nooses. Granger hammered a fist against the door, shouting Micah's name, his voice thick with whiskey and hate. Micah opened the door a crack, rifle hidden just out of sight. Granger leaned in, the stink of him foul and heavy. "We know what you're hiding, Holt," he snarled, eyes flicking toward the thin thread of smoke curling from the chimney. "You think you can shelter a redskin and walk among decent folk? Ain't no mercy for traitors." Micah said nothing, letting silence weigh heavier than any argument. Granger spat into the snow and mounted his horse, leaving behind words sharp as broken glass. "You got a choice, boy. Fix it, or we will." The hoofbeats faded into the night, but their echoes stayed lodged deep in Micah's chest. He closed the door slowly, resting his forehead against the rough wood. Behind him, Najcha stood very still, her face unreadable. She did not beg. She did not plead. Instead, she gathered her few belongings, the moccasins, the woven charm, a small pouch of herbs, and began to wrap herself in her worn cloak. She was leaving, not because she wanted to, but because she would not be the cause of his ruin. Micah moved without thinking, crossing the room in 3 long strides, catching her hand before she could slip into the night. Her hand was cold and small in his, but she did not pull away. For a long moment, they stood there, suspended between the life he had known and the life he had not yet dared to claim. The fire behind them crackled softly, throwing shadows against the walls. When he spoke, his voice was low, rough with things he could not name. "You don't have to go." Najcha looked up at him, something fierce and fragile burning in her gaze. Slowly, she unwrapped the cloak from her shoulders and let it fall to the floor. She stayed. They did not speak again that night. Words would have only broken the spell, scattered it like startled birds. Instead, they sat by the fire until sleep crept upon them like a soft, inevitable tide. In the days that followed, they prepared. Micah built stronger shutters for the windows, set traps not just for animals, but for men. Najcha taught him how to listen to the wind, to read its warnings hidden beneath its song. The bond between them, once gossamer thin, wove itself tighter with each shared breath, each small, fierce act of defiance. The days grew sharper, the light thin and brittle as spun glass. Snow no longer fell gently but scoured the earth, scraping over the cabin's walls like 1,000 desperate fingers. Micah could feel the world tightening around them, a noose braided from old grudges and fresh suspicion. He rode into town less often now, and when he did, he kept his hat low and his answers lower. The general store, once a place of muted camaraderie, had turned cold, the faces behind the counter stiff with something more dangerous than anger: certainty. The preacher, Reverend Harlan, had begun to preach from his steps rather than his pulpit, thick-voiced with fury, warning of corruption hidden in plain sight, of wolves in human skins, of the rot that kindness would bring. The settlers listened. Fear sharpened them faster than hunger. Micah kept his purchases brief: salt, flour, lead. He left without meeting anyone's gaze. He could feel their eyes on his back, 1,000 pinpricks of judgment trailing him all the way to the edge of town, where the widow Allen's house leaned wearily against the endless sky. She was waiting for him this time, a basket in her arms, her thin frame wrapped in a shawl that had once been bright but now hung faded and limp. "Take this," she said without preamble, pressing the basket into his arms. "And be ready." Inside, he found a loaf of bread, a slab of salted meat, a small wrapped bundle of herbs that smelled faintly of safety. Micah nodded once, the only thanks he trusted himself to give without breaking apart. Back at the cabin, Najcha met him at the door. Her eyes searched his face, reading the tension there as easily as the tracks left by a passing herd. "They know," he said simply, setting the basket down. She nodded as if she had expected no other ending. They moved through the days with a new, quiet urgency. Micah dug a second, well, closer to the house in case the main one was poisoned. Najcha taught him how to find water hidden beneath certain types of moss, how to gather the bitter roots that would stave off hunger when the stores ran dry. They laid traps, not just for the wolves who grew bolder with each passing night, but for men. Sometimes, when the wind was right, Micah swore he could hear voices riding its currents, angry, drunken, growing nearer. The nights became longer, the fire burning lower. They slept lightly, fully clothed, boots near at hand, weapons closer. One evening, just as the sun surrendered itself to the coming dark, Micah found Najcha sitting outside the cabin, facing the horizon. In her lap lay a piece of cloth she had been embroidering, though now her hands lay still. He sat beside her, not speaking. Together, they watched the stars ignite one by one, each a stubborn declaration against the night. "You could leave," she said finally, her voice barely louder than the breeze. "You could say I forced you. You could save yourself." Micah shook his head slowly. His throat felt too tight for words. She turned to him then, studying his face, searching for cracks in his resolve. There were none. Not anymore. That night, as they sat by the fire, Micah took a battered silver coin from his pocket, a keepsake from his brother Samuel, polished smooth by years of worry. He handed it to Najcha without ceremony. She looked at it, then at him, understanding flashing between them like a bolt of heat lightning across a summer sky. A promise, unspoken but ironclad. The next day brought a brittle sort of peace, the kind that comes before a storm. Micah split wood until his shoulders burned, stacking it neatly against the side of the cabin. Najcha smoked meat over the fire, braiding strips of it into ropes that could be carried easily should flight become necessary. Toward midday, the sound of hoofbeats cracked the air wide open. Micah stiffened, hand instinctively going to the rifle slung over the doorframe. Najcha stood, wiping her hands on her skirt, her body coiled and ready. Through the swirling snow, a group of riders emerged. 5 men, hard-eyed and hunched against the cold. At their head rode Tom Granger, his face twisted in a sneer that spoke of cruelty made personal. Micah stepped onto the porch, rifle resting against his shoulder, not raised yet, but not idle either. Granger reined his horse to a stop, spitting into the snow. "You had your warning, Holt," he called, his voice oily with satisfaction. "Ain't no more time for second chances." Behind him, the other men shifted, hands brushing against gun handles, boots tapping nervously against stirrups. Micah said nothing. Words would only feed the fire. Granger's eyes slid past him, catching sight of Najcha standing just behind the door. "Bring her out," he snarled. "We'll give her a fair trial." Micah tightened his grip on a rifle. His heart pounded so loud he could barely hear over it, but his hands remained steady. "You come one step closer," he said, his voice low and deadly calm, "and it'll be the last step you take." The riders hesitated. Courage came easier in a mob, but even 5 men could feel the shadow of death when it stretched its fingers toward them. Granger barked a laugh, but it rang hollow in the cold. "You gonna fight all of us for some filthy squaw?" He jeered. Micah didn't answer with words. He stepped off the porch. The message was clear. Behind him, Nashcham moved. She lifted the rifle they had kept ready near the door, cradling it with the ease of long familiarity. Her stance was steady, her aim true. Granger's sneer faltered. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then, with a string of curses, Granger yanked his horse around. One by one, the riders followed, though their glances backward promised this was not the end. Micah watched them until they disappeared into the falling snow, until the only sounds left were the whisper of wind through bare branches and the slow, steady drumbeat of his own heart. Inside, he and Najcha stoked the fire higher, setting pots of water to boil, checking the traps and the door latches again. They said little, but their movements were synchronized now. 2 parts of a single battered whole. Night fell thick and heavy. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and another answered, and another until the whole prairie seemed alive with their mourning. Micah sat near the fire, cleaning his rifle with slow, methodical care. Najshah sat across from him, weaving thin strips of cloth into a bandolier for extra ammunition. Every so often, their eyes would meet across the firelight, and something wordless would pass between them. Acknowledgement, gratitude, determination. The storm outside howled its fury, but within these 4 walls there was only a stubborn, defiant kind of peace. They were no longer waiting to be saved. They were no longer running from fear. They were standing together. The silence shattered like brittle ice beneath the thunder of hoofbeats. Micah was on his feet before the sound fully registered, rifle already in his grip, muscles taut as bowstrings. Najshah moved without a sound, her presence a shadow at his side, her eyes locked on the window where the warped glass blurred the world outside into fractured shapes. Through the frost-etched pane, a lone rider emerged from the storm's swirling veil, his silhouette hunched against the wind, his horse's breath fuming in the cold like a dragon's last exhale. The figure halted just beyond the porch, and the face that materialized from the gloom was one etched into Micah's memory with every ugly line of hatred. Tom Granger. His coat hung heavy with liquor and cruelty, his mouth twisted into a sneer that seemed permanently fused to his face, as if kindness had never dared touch him. "We know what you're hiding, Holt," Tom barked, his voice thick with whiskey and venom, the words slurred yet sharp enough to draw blood. He spat into the snow, the gesture deliberate, a mark of ownership over the very ground he stood on. "You think you can shelter a redskin and walk among decent folk?" His eyes flicked past Micah, searching, probing, hungry for proof of the crime he'd already judged. "Ain't no mercy for traitors, boy. You got a choice. Fix it, or we will." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a smoldering pyre, suffocating and inescapable. Before Micah could answer, though he knew no words would satisfy a man built from spite, Tom yanked his horse's reins, the animal rearing with a snore of protest. The rider vanished into the storm, his laughter trailing behind him like the echo of a gunshot, leaving only the crunch of hooves fading into the night. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, oblivious to the weight pressing down on the room. Najshah turned away from the window first, her movements swift and resolute. She moved to the corner where her few belongings lay. A pouch of herbs, the moccasins Micah had carved for her, the woven charm she'd gifted him days ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she bundled them into a scrap of cloth, her face unreadable but her intent clear. She would leave, not because she feared death, but because she would not let Micah face the storm alone. The settlers' wrath would not distinguish between complicity and courage. They would see only skin and history, and they would burn the cabin to ash for it. Micah saw her resolve in the set of her shoulders, the way she avoided his gaze as she fastened the cloak around her neck. Without thinking, he crossed the room in 3 strides, catching her wrist before she could step into the night. His grip was firm but not harsh, a tether between them that spoke of all the things they could not yet say. "You don't have to go," he said, his voice low and rough, as if the words had been dragged across gravel to reach his lips. Nasha turned to face him, her dark eyes blazing with something fierce and fragile, a defiance that trembled on the edge of surrender. In that moment, the cabin itself seemed to hold its breath, the fire casting long shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. The storm howled outside, but within, the space between them narrowed. Nazca's fingers curled slightly against his grip, a silent acknowledgement of the choice he was making, a choice that bound them not by circumstance, but by will. Slowly, deliberately, she let the cloak slip from her shoulders, the fabric pooling at her feet like a discarded ghost. She stayed. They did not speak again that night. Words would have only fractured the fragile truce they had forged, scattering it like startled birds. Instead, they sank onto the floor near the hearth, the fire's glow painting their faces in hues of amber and gold. The heat seeped into their bones, a small defiance against the cold that gnawed at the cabin's walls. Micah leaned back against the stool, his rifle resting within reach, but forgotten, while Nasha sat cross-legged beside him, her hands folded in her lap. Their shoulders nearly brushed, a nearness that spoke louder than any vow. Outside, the wind carried the scent of snow and danger, but within, the silence was not empty. It was full, humming with the weight of unspoken promises. The fire popped and spat, sending sparks spiraling into the air, tiny stars that mirrored the ones hidden beyond the storm clouds. For the first time, the cabin felt less like a refuge from the world and more like a world unto itself, a place where 2 souls, battered by history and prejudice, could carve out a space where trust grew thicker than fear. Their hands hovered close, inches apart, the space between them a question neither dared to answer yet. But the nearness was enough. A bridge built not of words, but of choice, of defiance, of the quiet understanding that they were no longer alone. The night stretched long and restless, but neither moved. Sleep came slowly, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and the unspoken truth that whatever came next, they would face it together. Winter tightened its grip like a vice, gnawing at the edges of the world, until even the stars seemed to shiver in the sky. The wind howled through the trees, carrying ice that bit into the cabin's wooden walls like 1,000 tiny teeth. Micah worked in silence, his breath visible in the frigid air as he nailed thick shutters over every window, each hammer strike a promise of defiance. Nasha moved beside him, her hands steady as she wove dried herbs into bundles to hang near the hearth, their earthy scent mingling with the smoke. She taught him to read the wind's warnings, the way it shifted pitch before a storm, the scent of distant snow carried on its breath, the hush that fell before danger crept too close. Their bond thickened like the ice on the river, woven tighter with every shared breath, every glance that lingered a heartbeat too long. Words were still scarce between them, but action spoke louder. A hand brushing against a shoulder, a shared bowl of stew warmed over the fire, the way they stood back to back when checking the traps at dusk, their shoulders nearly touching. One morning, the widow Allen arrived again, her horse's breath fuming in the cold as she reined it to a stop outside the cabin. Her face, weathered by years of loss, was drawn tight with urgency. "More men," she warned, her voice low but sharp as a blade. "Higher guns, Strangers who don't care what reasons you've got, only who pays their wage. Micah nodded, his jaw clenched against the weight of her words. Najcha stepped forward, her hand pressing lightly to his chest, grounding him as if to say, "You're not alone." The widow handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth, a loaf of bread, a slab of salted meat, and a pouch of dried herbs, before turning her horse back toward town without another word. They spent the next days reinforcing the cabin. Micah dug deeper pits for traps along the forest's edge, lining them with sharpened stakes hidden beneath brittle branches. Najcha braided ropes from rawhide, stringing them low between trees to trip approaching riders. They stockpiled food, dried venison, jars of root vegetables, sacks of flour, and boiled water to pour from the windows if the walls were breached. At night, they sat by the fire, sharpening blades and loading bullets, their movements synchronized like a dance rehearsed in silence. That evening, as the fire crackled and spat, Najcha reached in her pouch and drew out a slender strip of leather, its edges frayed but sturdy. She had threaded it with beads, small, polished stones dyed in hues of amber and deep blue, symbols of protection from her people's traditions. She held it out to Micah, her dark eyes unreadable. He hesitated, then took it, his fingers clumsy as he tied one end around her wrist, the beads clicking softly against her skin. When she lifted her hand to return the gesture, fastening the other end around his own wrist, their fingers brushed. A spark passed between them, fleeting but undeniable. No words were needed. The bracelet was a vow, a tether binding them not just to survival, but to each other, a promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. Outside, the wind screamed, but inside, the fire burned brighter. Dawn arrived bloodless, the sky a pale, bruised gray that stretched endlessly over the prairie. The world seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the soft crunch of snow settling on the cabin's roof. For a fleeting moment, it felt like peace might endure. But then, hoofbeats shattered the quiet. A sharp, rhythmic drumming that grew louder, faster, until riders emerged through the swirling snow. 5 men, their faces hardened by cruelty and whiskey, fanned out before the cabin. At their head sat Tom Granger, his horse snorting plumes of steam into the cold. His sneer twisted his face as he spat into the snow. "Bring her out," he barked, voice thick with malice. "We'll give her a fair trial." The words dripped with mockery, a lie wrapped in the guise of justice. Micah stepped onto the porch, rifle steady in his grip. His knuckles were white against the wood, but his stance was unyielding, a man rooted to the earth itself. He said nothing. Words would only feed the fire in Granger's eyes. Instead, he descended the steps slowly, deliberately, each footfall a challenge. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open. Najcha appeared, rifle cradled in her arms, her posture as unshakable as the mountains. Granger's sneer faltered, his gaze flicking between the two of them. For the first time, the riders hesitated. They had expected fear, begging, surrender. Not this. A hunter and a woman standing side by side, defiance etched into every line of their bodies. The standoff stretched, taut as a bowstring. Wolves howled in the distance, their cries weaving with the wind, a primal reminder of the wilderness that cared nothing for human grudges. Granger cursed under his breath, yanking his horse's reins so violently the animal reared. One by one, the riders followed, their curses trailing behind them like smoke. Micah didn't lower his rifle until the last of them vanished into the storm. Inside, the cabin hummed with quiet urgency. They boiled water to pour from the windows, checked traps set deep in the snow, stoked the fire until its heat pressed against the walls. Every movement was synchronized, a silent pact to stand firm. That night, wolves howled again, their voices threading through the cracks in the logs. The cabin's walls held stubborn peace. but the air crackled with the knowledge that dawn would bring more than just light. It would bring reckoning. The second nightfall arrived like a funeral shroud, the horizon flickering with the jagged glow of torchlight. The town had gathered, a mob stitched together by fear and self-righteous fury, their torches casting long, wavering shadows that danced like vengeful spirits across the snow. Micah stood at the window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the riders form a ragged line at the tree line. Their faces were masks of hatred, their hands gripping rifles and ropes with the certainty of men who believed they were doing God's work. Najcha moved behind him, silent but present, her presence a steadying weight against the storm brewing in his chest. Together, they had prepared all day. Snares hidden beneath fresh snow, spikes driven deep into the porch steps, every crack in the cabin's walls sealed against the cold and the enemy. The attack came without warning. A single gunshot split the silence, and then chaos erupted. Gunfire shattered the stillness, bullets pinging against the cabin's wooden walls as Micah fired from the upper window, his rifle bucking against his shoulder. He struck the first rider, a man whose horse reared and collapsed in the snow, its rider groaning before falling still. Najcha worked beside him, reloading with practiced efficiency, her hands steady even as smoke and fear thickened the air. She passed him bullets without a word, her eyes sharp for danger. When fury blurred his vision, when the screams of the dying and the scent of gunpowder threatened to drown him, she pulled him back, her grip grounding him like an anchor. Granger led the charge, his horse surging forward with reckless abandon. But the ground betrayed him. A hidden rope, strung low between trees, caught the animal's legs. The horse stumbled, pitching Granger forward. He hit the frozen earth hard, the impact a sickening crunch that silenced even the wind. The other riders faltered, their formation unraveling as panic spread like wildfire. For every step forward they took, the cabin's defenses answered. Snares snapped shut around ankles, stakes rose from hidden pits, and Micah's relentless aim cut down those who dared press closer. By dawn, the tide had turned. The riders fled, their torches extinguished in the snow, their threats scattered like chaff before the wind. The cabin stood, its walls scarred by bullets, its shutters splintered but unbroken. Inside, Micah and Najcha sat in the aftermath, the firelight reflecting the exhaustion and resolve in their eyes. They had survived, but the world would not forget. A week passed in the fragile hush of winter's retreat. The river sang louder now, its voice swollen with the melt of ice and snow, carving new paths through the thawing earth. Micah knelt at its edge, letting water slip through his fingers, the cold biting into his skin like a reminder of all that remained unresolved. Najcha gathered roots nearby, her movements deliberate, her presence as steady as the mountain that loomed beyond the valley. She paused, watching him, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. "They'll come again," she said, her voice low but certain. Micah nodded, his jaw tightening as he stared at his reflection rippling in the current. A man hardened by survival, softened only by the woman who stood beside him. That night, they buried the dead. The graves were shallow, dug with rough hands and marked with stones to honor even those who had come to destroy them. Micah knelt by the river, clutching a battered silver coin, the last relic of his brother Samuel, and tossed it into the water. It flashed once in the moonlight before disappearing into the depths, a letting go of guilt, grief, and the ghost that had haunted him for too long. Najcha watched in silence, her dark eyes reflecting the stars above, her heart a mirror to his own quiet reckoning. By the fire, they planned for spring, a garden to grow food, a repaired roof to shield them from the storms, and cautious trade with distant Navajo settlements if peace could be brokered. Simple dreams, radical dreams, dreams woven from blood and hope, stitched together by the belief that kindness could still take root in a savage world. Micah lay back in the grass, the warmth of the sun lingering on his skin, and turned his head to find Nasha watching him. Her fingers brushed his, a touch as light as a promise. "I used to think this world only knew how to take," he said, his voice rough with the weight of memory. Nasha smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips. "And now?" He grinned, the expression rare and unguarded. "Now, I know it can give back, if you're brave enough to hold on." The river sang on, its song eternal, indifferent to the struggles of men. The mountain watched, its slopes etched with the scars of time. Somewhere in the wide, listening darkness, the world shifted just enough for two souls to believe in the miracle of survival. Together, they were no longer hunters or the hunted, but something far greater, a testament to resilience, to love forged in the crucible of adversity. The stars blinked above, and for a moment, the universe seemed to pause, holding its breath in quiet witness to the fragile, breathtaking truth of them. The river sang louder, fed by the melt of winter's grip, its voice a low, ceaseless hymn that carried through the valley like a prayer. Micah knelt at its edge, letting the icy water slip through his fingers, each drop a reminder of the fragile thread between life and death. Behind him, Nasha moved through the trees, gathering roots and bark, her presence steady as the mountain itself. The cabin, battered but unbroken, stood farther up the slope, smoke curling from its chimney, a thin thread of defiance against the endless sky. They had buried the dead days ago, rough prayers muttered over shallow graves. The attackers had fled, but the world beyond the hills would not forget. The widow Allen's warning still echoed in Micah's mind. More men. Hired guns. Strangers who don't care what reasons you have, only who pays their wage. He tightened his grip on his rifle, the wood worn smooth by sweat and fear. Nasha pressed a hand to his chest, grounding him with a silent promise. "You're not alone." By dusk, they reinforced the cabin. Boiling water waited by the windows. Spikes lay hidden beneath fresh snow, ropes strung low between trees to unseat riders. Inside, the fire burned bright, venison roasting over the flames. They sat close but did not touch, their connection woven into the marrow of their bones. Nasha unwrapped a bundle, two slender bands of woven leather and beads, her offering wordless. Micah tied one around her wrist, his fingers clumsy but sure. No vows needed. Their shared breath was enough. When dawn crept gray and shivering over the hills, the riders came. No warnings, no demands. Only the thunder of hooves and the crack of rifle fire. Micah fired first, striking a rider before the man could raise his weapon. Nasha moved beside him, quick and sure, reloading, passing ammunition, pulling him back when fury blurred his vision. They fought not for vengeance, but for the life they'd carved with bare hands and stubborn hope. By noon, the tide turned. The attackers faltered, bloodied and beaten. The last to flee was a man whose eyes mirrored Micah's past, a reflection of what he might have become if fear had ruled him. Micah lowered his rifle. The man vanished into the trees. Silence settled, broken only by the labored breath of the earth itself. Nasha pressed her forehead to Micah's chest, her arms wrapping around him with a fierceness that nearly buckled his knees. Later, they buried the dead with rough hands, marking graves with stones, so even those who had come to destroy might not be forgotten. Not forgiveness, just a quiet truth that every soul had once been a child who knew hope. At the riverbank, Micah tossed his brother Samuel's silver coin into the water, a letting go, a beginning. Nasha smiled, small and knowing. They sat together, the sun warm against their backs, planting a garden, mending the roof, trading with Navajo settlements if peace could be brokered. Simple dreams, radical dreams, sacred dreams. As night fell soft in velvet, they built a fire by the water's edge, sharing food and silence. The stars blinked above, indifferent and eternal. Micah lay back, his fingers brushing hers. I used to think this world only knew how to take, he said. Nazca turned to him, her eyes reflecting starlight. And now, he grinned slow and sure. Now, I know it can give back, if you're brave enough to hold on. The river sang on. The mountain watched. Somewhere, the world shifted just enough for two souls to believe in the miracle of survival.